Hey guys, welcome back to Clownfish TV. This is Kneon and I'm going to be flying solo in this video. Geeky Sparkles is busy working on other things, as she often is. She's going to be in a live stream with me later tonight, but going to talk about the comic book industry. She kicked this story over to me coming from the Hollywood Reporter that the comic book industry avoided implosion in 2020. That the comic book industry did not just up and die as some people predicted, but did they really predict that it would just poof disappear, or is it actually dying by degrees? It depends on who you ask. So we're going to talk about that. I don't think comics are fine, at least the mainstream industry. I think other avenues for making comics are doing very well, which we've said for years on this channel, that manga is doing fine, that crowdfunding is fine, but the direct market, you really have to hone in on that. The direct market is what we're talking about when we talk about comic books for the most part. So before we get into it, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, guys. We're over 165,000 subs. Thanks for the support. We talk about comics, but it's just a tiny part of what we talk about here on Clownfish TV. We have news and opinions on animation, comics, anime, manga, video games, movies, whatever interests us that day. Sometimes it's just a stupid story we saw somewhere. You know, it is kind of a mixed bag over here, but we do love talking about comics, the comic book industry. I actually worked in the comic book industry for a number of years, mostly on Disney titles. And yeah, it's not financially, it's not a very healthy place to be. At least the direct market is not a very good place to be right now. You know, we talk about DC Comics and all the job cuts they've had lately. They've had 3 rounds. I guess it's going to be 3 rounds of layoffs to their editorial staff, but also a lot of their freelancers are finding themselves without work because they're looking at the solicitations for next year and realizing that books they were supposed to work on are gone. They're snapped away. They're canceled, apparently. And you know, DC Comics doesn't know what it is at this point. It's trying to figure it out. They're trying to figure out how to be profitable to stay in the good graces of their overlords at Warner Media and AT&T, who are looking to cut any extra fat. And that's just DC Comics. Something similar is kind of going on over at Marvel, although not to the extent of what's going on at DC. And you keep hearing about this all the time. And Bleeding Cool actually put out at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's why I think these articles are in response to that. 2020 and the COVID, the shutdown, would be an extinction level event for the comic shops, for many comic publishers. And I still think that might be the case before it's all said and done. The game's not over yet. You know, the game is not over yet because there's going to be irreparable damage done, unfortunately, to many publishers and comic shops via 2020. And they're not really going to understand how bad it was until next year, going into next year. Right now, everybody's optimistic. They're trying to be optimistic. It's kind of like Disney. They're like, yeah, we had our worst year in recent memory, but it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be. And that's kind of what's going on with comics. But you got to realize, too, they're also, when they're talking about comics, at sites like Polygon and the Hollywood Reporter, they're not just talking about the comic book shops, the direct market. They're talking about manga. They're talking about Scholastic. They're talking about Webtoon. They're talking about crowdfunding. And to prop up the comic book industry at this point, you have to bring all of these other kinds of comics, sales channels into the bigger picture to make your case. Because if you just looked at the direct market, it's pretty bad. If you looked at the state of a lot of comic shops right now, it's pretty bad. Now, this decline happened before the pandemic, mind you. A lot of comic shops I know, they've actually decided that they weren't going to sell new comics because they couldn't sell them. They didn't want to risk it on unproven sellers. And a lot of the stuff they'd been getting from Marvel in particular had been sitting on the shelves. So a lot of comic shops now are just selling back issues, and they're doing well, I guess, selling those back issues. A couple shops I can think of, they're doing very well, buying entire collections, and that's the stuff people want. I mean, it's kind of the same reason I went back to buying vinyl. I wanted that physical object again. I wanted to be able to look at the album cover art and the liner notes And it's also a trip down memory lane because the albums I'm buying, for the most part, are older recordings that I grew up with that I want to have a physical copy of. And I think that's the case for a lot of people now with comics. I don't know if they're buying a lot of the new stuff or just going back and buying runs of comics from the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, stuff that they thought was better than what's being put out today. But you can't deny that the direct market, the superhero arm of the comic book industry is not in very good shape right now. But it could be worse. It can always be worse. It doesn't mean it's good. It could totally be worse. So the Hollywood Reporter, Heat Vision, how the comic industry avoid a 2020 implosion. And they talked about publishers and stores fearing the shutdown that would be an extinction level threat. And the industry has proved to be more resilient. I'm not dead. I'm just very badly burnt. They're very badly burnt. They talked about how a lot of shops like Forbidden Planet were able to survive via curbside and also through crowdfunding and GoFundMes. I know we wound up giving to a couple of shops, GoFundMes to a couple of shops that we had a soft spot for. I think Forbidden Planet might have actually been one of them. But, that's not really a long-term solution. We don't know what's going to happen after the pandemic. We do know a lot of shops closed their doors during the pandemic because they're like, we're never coming back from this, especially out in California, states like that. They're still in lockdown. It's like, we're not coming back. We're not coming back. But it was interesting to read this. In March, when COVID hit the comic industry in earnest, many retailers and publishers feared it would be an apocalyptic event for the business. Stay-at-home orders shuttered stores, and shipments of new products ceased for several months when Diamond Comics distributors hit pause. When Diamond crawled under the desk into the fetal position and started sucking its thumb and left the comic book industry to fend for itself, and then came back and made a big deal about how, hey, the comeback's going to be great, guys. It's all going to be good. Everything's going to be good. Diamond, by the way, had to lay a bunch of people off. I don't know if this has been widely publicized. I have a couple of friends who worked for Diamond for years. In fact, I used to freelance for Diamond, for Gemstone. I used to work on their Disney books. And I've still got friends over there. And some of them who've been there for many, many years were posting on social media that they were laid off. So Diamond's not doing so hot either, guys, especially with DC Comics pulling out. But I digress. Stores have struggled to survive and some have shuttered. However, months after the comic book industry restarted, accompanied by a publicity campaign proclaiming that the industry's comeback will be bigger than the setback, there are multiple signs that comics has proven to be far stronger than anyone, including those inside the industry, expected in the face of an uncertain year. The biggest surprise started during May and June as we were allowed to reopen, comics started shipping again, and customers were slowly starting to come back to the shop. Customers were buying comics, a lot of comics. California retailer Ryan Higgins told The Hollywood Reporter. Comic supply sales skyrocketed right away as people took this time to clean up their collection. New titles were selling better than we expected. Graphic novel sales spiked and back issues jumped dramatically in price and flew out the door just as fast. Sales during the summer and early fall months were unbelievable. Well, that's good for him. It is good for him. That was a pattern repeated across the country, according to Diamond, which handles the majority of comic shipments in North America. Well, I know Diamond had to lay people off, and I know Diamond's hurt now because they don't have DC. DC, the second biggest publisher in the US, left Diamond entirely in June, ending an association that had lasted decades. In a statement to press earlier this month, the chief purchasing officer at Diamond said that the company has, in the last financial quarter of the year, seen a lot of stabilization in ordering patterns, and in many cases, these baseline numbers have exceeded our expectations. That doesn't sound like a home run to me. That sounds very carefully worded. Well, guys, it's bad. It's really, really bad, but it's not as bad as it could have been. And, at least things didn't completely collapse, right? It says that the sales patterns have stayed consistent, with X-Men and Batman remaining the most valuable franchises at Marvel and DC. So yeah, they were only shipping 5.9 million comics in March, and in October, 7 million comics. Demon Slayer, and we're going to do a video about Demon Slayer. Demon Slayer sold like 100 and some million copies just of that title. But I'm just putting salt in the wound. Japan does it better. They do it better. It said they're both behind the equivalent months in 2019 with the X-Men relaunch, but per release, the sales levels are improved. And as the number of releases continues to build back up, you can see it fully catching up. So we're going to go back to the flat line, I guess, the comic book flat line, where basically this is how many comics the direct market can sell in a month, and that's basically it. And it slowly, gradually declines as people age out of the hobby or lose interest in the hobby because the kids aren't buying the monthly comics. You know, they're just not. You can keep telling yourself that they are, and you keep trying to get people into the comic shops, but for the most part, it's adult collectors. So then they go on to kind of pad this out a little bit, talking about how 2020 was a year in which crowdfunding became more important in comics. Forbidden Planet raised $75,000 via a campaign on GoFundMe, launched in April, which the store used to stay afloat. And then they raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in art auctions, and they talk about Kickstarter projects doing well. They don't mention Indiegogo, of course. Of course, they don't mention Indiegogo in some of the six-figure projects there, but you know, Aspen Comics did $275,000 on Kickstarter, and that's all that matters is Kickstarter. Another company that has explored a direct-to-consumer offering in the face of 2020's challenges is Vault Comics, as part of a significant reevaluation of operating practices at the company. There's one specific lesson that's worth sharing. It's this. This kind of ongoing widespread crisis will systematically break down everyone on your team. Right now, this is coming from the CEO of Vault. Right now, everyone is cut off from their ordinary personal support structures. To get through anything like this, you have to rethink how you operate, building a new relief valve and support systems. Look, this is, God, this is funny. This is everything that indie creators and YouTubers who do comics, everything that they've been saying for years. That direct-to-consumer is probably the future. You don't need Diamond. I remember even back in the 90s and 2000s, indie creators were like, you don't need Diamond to sell your comics. And you shouldn't rely on Diamond, because if you rely on Diamond and they duck out for whatever reason, you're screwed. And here it is. It took a catastrophe like this to wake people up to that. They're talking about offering work direct to readers. Vault's doing it. You know, they did not interview Peter Simeti over at Alterna Comics. They've been doing it for a while now. IDW gets in there. Hey guys, we're still around. I don't know if they're going to make it for another year or two, but what do you do? So yeah, they're like, oh, comics are going to be fine. Yeah, I think comics as an art form are going to be fine, but I don't think the direct market's going to be fine. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about superhero comics, monthly comics, in the direct market. And I don't think it's going to be fine, guys. That's not going to be fine. Manga's going to be fine. Graphic novels will be fine. Innovative publishers who come up with a better way to distribute comics or go direct to consumer, they'll probably be fine. But the comic book industry as we've known it is not fine. It's not going to be fine. Polygon actually spells it out a little bit better, says that comics reinvented themselves in 2020 to survive. And they talk about crowdfunding, and they talk about direct-to-consumer, and all these other things that YouTubers have been talking about for years, that the mainstream comic book industry has been taking a steaming shit on YouTubers for saying that they didn't know what they're talking about, yada, 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 yada. And here it is, guys. So Polygon talking about graphics and Random House Graphics with their YA graphic novels, and Dave Pilkey of Dogman. Of course, Dogman is an outlier. That's like saying, every basketball player is Michael Jordan. That's not the case. But then they said it was still a difficult year. Multiple publishers faced layoffs, none more significantly than DC, which saw a drastic reduction of staff as part of a larger change at Warner Brothers. The lack of in-person comic conventions was devastating to artists who relied on those for income. That is also true. When I did comics full-time, we relied on conventions. If we did not have conventions, the mortgage would not have been paid on time. I'm just saying, the convention money was significantly better than the comic book money. As opportunities dried up, some creators went from a full slate to nothing overnight. The new sales tactics at comic shops require more effort than ever. At a time when staff had to be minimized, The moves were costly, both from a financial and mental health standpoint. But that's exactly why the story of comics in 2020 isn't one of disaster. It was one of resilience, of perseverance, and most of all, reinvention. Okay, that's good. But I'm like, again, it's kind of frustrating to read this when we know behind the scenes the mainstream comic book industry has been shitting on people who said that this is the direction you had to go in. You had to do indie comics, you had to do crowdfunding, you had to find a way around Diamond. And it's not just YouTubers, it's not just Comicsgate, it's not just, those groups. I'm talking 20 years ago. There were independent creators who said you need to do an end run around the system because it doesn't work and it's got too many potential points of failure. And we saw everything go offline, and the people who survived were the people who found another way to do comics. Again, comics will survive in some form, for sure. But the comic book industry, the mainstream comic book industry, that is another story entirely. And I do believe that the direct market is going to collapse more or less within the next couple of years because I don't think it's sustainable. And if DC Comics pulls out almost entirely, and it looks like they're kind of going in that direction, then a lot of comic shops are going to follow suit. But now is a good time to build a life raft. Now is a good time to find another way to make and sell comics outside of this very flawed, very fragile system. If nothing else, 2020 showed us just how fragile the comic book ecosystem is. And if you want to actually make money and have a sustainable career, you can't depend on all of these other potential points of failure. Going to wrap it up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, and we'll talk later.